Mark Turner returned with a limp in his step and a small wooden box in hand. On the porch, 6-year-old Eli clutched his worn backpack. Inside it a crumpled note from Sarah, the mother who had gone. No fireworks, no cheers. Just a creaking swing, a wind-carried drawing, and a trembling not strong enough to break your heart. The old bus pulled away, leaving a pale gray ribbon of diesel smoke curling into the air. The engine's rumble faded, and in its absence came silence, the kind that presses in when the world suddenly grows too still. Gravel shifted underfoot, slow and uneven. Mark Turner stood motionless for a few seconds, as if his legs no longer knew how to claim the ground beneath him. His faded military jacket hung loose over one shoulder, and his shadow stretched long behind him, carrying a weight he could never quite set down. Ahead lay the short road into town. The last light of day broke into silver patches across the dirt, fading and disappearing into the tree-line. Mark took a step down, his knee flaring with the same old pain. Every stride struck like a knock on memory marches through red dust, sudden detonations, the flash before a friend's face vanished forever. The past never asked permission. It surged back like a tide, sweeping across even the quiet this town tried so hard to hold. In his hand, he held a small wooden box, rough along the edges. It was all he brought for his return. Inside sat a toy airplane, its wings carved with 2 uneven letters, E.T. Eli Turner. Clumsy work, but to Mark it was the only proof that a line still stretched between father and son. His heartbeat quickened, not from the distance ahead but from fear itself. Fear that when the door finally opened, Eli wouldn't run into his arms but would only stare back, eyes uncertain, as if he were a stranger. Fear that the war's shadow still lingered in his own eyes, twisting his smile, turning his hands too callous to be gentle again. His breathing faltered, broke apart, then steadied. The evening wind carried the damp scent of earth and wild grass, pulling him back to where he was. This wasn't a desert burning under artillery fire. No bullets slicing the air. Only the same road where he once walked alongside Eli's small bicycle, steadying the handlebars with one hand on a summer evening, before everything shifted. Mark drew in a long breath. He knew the past would never leave. It would travel with him always, like a shadow stretching with every step. But that knowledge didn't crush him anymore. It reminded him, strength isn't found in forgetting. Strength is in walking forward while carrying both pain and hope. The sun lowered, pouring dusk across his shoulders. His shadow lengthened, folding into the trees at the road's edge. Mark adjusted the jacket, tightened his grip on the box. Then he moved forward, his step longer, firmer. The box felt heavier in his hand, yet inside his chest, something had grown lighter. And within the fear still humming low, he discovered another silence, the silence of resilience. Mark walked slowly down the dirt road, the wooden box firm in his hand, yet the heavier weight pressed against his back. In the smaller pocket of his backpack lay a worn envelope. Sarah's letter. The paper had yellowed, its folds etched deep like scars. At the corner, a smudge spread gray across the fibers, perhaps from rain, perhaps from the time Eli dropped it while rummaging through his things. Each time Mark touched it, his calloused fingers grew clumsy, as if one wrong movement might tear it apart. The message inside was brief: "I'll come back when things are steady. Keep Eli with you." The words hurried, the strokes unsteady, marked with exhaustion. No explanations. No date of return. Just a fragile promise, suspended like a rope bridge between two cliffs. Mark had read it dozens of times, in sleepless nights at the rehab center, when pain from his knee and the battlefield converged. Every reading brought the same quiet dread: would Sarah really come back? And if she didn't, who would Eli believe in? He pictured his son holding that letter, small fingers tracing each line, searching for certainty. But children don't yet know that some promises dissolve like breath in cold air. All Eli had was a piece of paper. And still, that piece became his only thread of hope, his proof that his mother remembered him. A breeze stirred. Mark stopped walking, swung the backpack off his shoulders, and pulled the letter free. He stood at the roadside, evening light pouring across his frame. The paper trembled in the wind, carrying the stale scent of ink and time. Reading again, he no longer saw the words, only the spaces around them, wide, hollow, unspoken. That emptiness was what Sarah had left behind. No answers. No farewells. No apologies. And somehow, he knew Eli felt that emptiness too. His chest sank heavy. There was no anger, no bitterness, only truth. He couldn't change Sarah's past, couldn't erase the blurred stain on this page. But he could decide not to let Eli wait for a promise that might never hold. Mark folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the pocket. His hand lingered at the edge, sealing more than just paper. The fear hadn't left, but a choice appeared: let the past rule him, or stand steady so Eli's present wouldn't hang in suspension. With that thought, his stride grew firmer. The dirt road ahead was no longer just the way home. It was the threshold he had to cross, the line between a faded promise and a living presence. The house appeared after the bend, quiet as though the whole town was conspiring to guard its silence. The wooden fence leaned tiredly, weathered gray, some slats already rotting, tilted outward. On the worn porch sat Eli. Knees pulled close, small hands locked around the strap of a faded backpack, holding it like it carried the whole world inside. His eyes were wide open, but no tears fell. The silence wrapped around him was so dense it made Mark stop short. It wasn't the silence of calm, it was the silence of a child afraid that even the faintest sound might drive someone away again. Mark clenched the wooden box tighter, his breath caught in his chest. He had pictured this moment 100 times, Eli running out, laughing, arms flung around him. Instead, the reality was a small statue of a boy, frozen, defending himself without a word. Above them, an old American flag hung limp, its colors bleached by years of sun. The porch swing creaked faintly in the breeze, but Eli didn't look up. He seemed trapped in his own suspended moment, where time refused to move forward and waiting had become a way of being. Mark took a step closer. Gravel crackled underfoot, yet Eli didn't stir. His grip on the backpack only tightened, knuckles turning white. Mark knew that bag carried more than notebooks or crayons. Inside lay Sarah's wrinkled letter, carrying the fragile hope of her return. And now Eli sat guarding it, as though protecting the last thin thread of belief left to him. Fear rose in Mark. Not fear of rejection, but fear that silence had become armor around the boy's heart. A 6-year-old shouldn't already know how to defend himself this way. Yet Mark saw it clearly. Eli had learned to press everything inward, to clutch hope tight and say nothing, just like soldiers who came home with unspoken wars. He wanted to call his son's name, but his throat locked. He realized if he shattered the silence with sound, it would break like glass, leaving jagged edges instead of reunion. So he stood there, only a few steps away, feeling the gap between them like an ocean. Dusk thickened overhead, the evening wind drifting past with the scent of damp soil and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Everything looked ordinary, yet father and son were caught in a suffocating moment, where past and present pressed hard against each other. In that unblinking gaze, Mark saw himself years ago, a boy waiting for a father who never returned. Old pain overlapped the fear of now, making his hands tremble. Yet in that reflection, something else sparked. He could not let history repeat itself. He drew a long breath. No rushing. No sudden words. He knew this silence needed patience, needed respect. And in that waiting, something steady rose inside him, a quiet resilience, a vow that his son would not spend one more day sitting alone on a porch, waiting in that heavy silence. Mark's eyes fixed on the elbow of Eli's sweater. A loose thread of yarn had unraveled, winding itself around the boy's wrist like an invisible tether holding him in place. The sweater, pale gray and worn thin, carried uneven stitches that revealed the effort of the hands that made it. Sarah had knitted it one winter before she left. Back then, Mark was still away on base. He'd only seen the sweater in a photo she mailed, Eli smiling faintly, clutching the brand new garment. Now it was faded, frayed, its fabric roughened by time. Yet Eli still wore it, in warmth or chill, as if clinging to the last trace of his mother's hands. Mark could see it clearly. A fragile hold, stubbornly kept, much like the way he once held on to his father's old pocket knife, the only piece left behind by a man who walked out and never returned. A memory pressed in. Mark remembered a night on the porch at 10 years old, bundled in his own frayed sweater, pocket knife in hand, waiting to hear the sound of his father's car. But the road stayed dark. Crickets filled the night, singing against the silence of an absence no one explained. The cold didn't come from wind, but from the emptiness growing inside. Looking at Eli now was like staring back through time. Old wounds layered over new fears, tightening his chest. He dreaded the thought of Eli learning the same cruel lesson, that grown-ups don't always keep promises, and waiting can carve a scar deeper than words. A gust of wind tugged the thread farther loose, swaying in the air like it might snap. Eli didn't notice, still hugging his backpack, eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of his shoes. At 6 years old, he already leaned on objects to carry what he couldn't speak: the sweater from his mother, the letter she wrote, the battered bag. Mark inched closer, his hand twitching with the urge to pull the thread free. But he stopped short. That small gesture suddenly felt immense. If he unwound it, would he be stripping away Eli's last fragile anchor? Or would it be a way of showing him it was time to let go of a memory too thin to hold and take instead what was solid, a father's arms? A chill ran along Mark's spine. He realized he was standing at a threshold, not just between fence and porch, but between generations. He had once sat still, tying his childhood to a lifeless object. Now he couldn't let his son repeat it. He tightened his grip on the wooden box. The creak of its lid echoed faintly in his palm. Fear hadn't left, but something else had begun to grow: resolve. He would step forward. He would find a way to cut the invisible thread, not with hands, but with his presence, steady and real. Mark's hand rested on the gate's faded wood. The once green paint had peeled away, flaking like old skin over a wound that never healed. His fingers pressed lightly, testing its weight. One push, and it would swing open. Yet he didn't. Through the window, a fragment of memory clung to the wall. A family photo, taken in autumn when the porch was littered with yellow leaves. Sarah stood beside him, one hand on Eli's shoulder, who was only 4 then. The smile in the picture was thin, almost strained, but still enough to pass for ordinary. Now the frame hung crooked, dust gathering along the edges. The evening light slanted across it, illuminating only half of Sarah's face, leaving her as little more than a shadow. Mark swallowed hard. He knew what held him back. Not the gate, not the door, but the emptiness waiting behind it. Silence could roar loud enough to swallow any words he might bring home. He remembered military days, standing outside doors of newly cleared houses. Fellow soldiers stormed in, but he always paused. Inside there was rarely life, just overturned tables, walls scarred with holes, a toy abandoned on the floor. What haunted him wasn't the noise of war, but the absence. And now he feared stepping into another kind of absence, the hollow left by Sarah, by the life that had once been called family. The wind rattled the porch roof. The swing creaked again, a sound circling back like a reminder that time kept moving while he stood still. Eli sat only a few steps away, yet Mark felt miles apart. He wondered, what would he find inside? A cold house with untouched furniture? Or the faint traces of Sarah, a cup left half full, a scarf draped over a chair, things that reminded him she had once been here but was long gone? Fear pressed tighter against his chest. Yet another thought crept in: he couldn't remain at the gate forever. This fence, this door, they weren't the real barrier. The barrier lay within his chest, where past and present tangled into a knot. Mark drew in a long breath. He knew unraveling it wouldn't be easy, but he also understood this: if he didn't cross over, Eli would keep living in silence, inside frayed sweaters and unanswered letters. And Mark himself would remain the figure missing from that crooked frame on the wall. His hand slipped from the latch. Not in surrender, but in recognition. He would return. He would step inside. But for now, he let himself stand in that space between fear and resolve, acknowledging the emptiness so that when he finally faced it, he could stand firm instead of falling apart. Eli sat curled on the porch, his thin arms wrapped tightly around a small backpack, as if inside lay a secret no one else could touch. The bag was worn, its fabric faded, one strap torn and stitched back together with green thread. It was more than something to carry, it was the only thing Eli trusted to keep himself from slipping away. Mark noticed the tension in his son's hands. Small knuckles pushed white, fingers locked around the strap as if someone might try to take it. He knew what was inside: the letter Sarah had left, folded and creased from years of clutching. The scrawled, hurried line read, "Be good, I'll come back." Just 5 words, but they had become the lone raft a 6-year-old clung to in an ocean of absence. Mark shivered. He had held that letter once, in a long night at the rehab center. The paper was thin, the ink blurred at the corner, its promise barely legible. He remembered reading only fragments, while Eli mouthed it from memory, over and over, as though it were a charm to ward off despair. To the boy, those words weren't just ink. They were a lifeline. In war, Mark had seen soldiers cling to scraps of paper, a photograph, a torn piece of fabric. No one mocked it. Everyone understood, when surrounded by loss, you needed something tangible to prove you were still tethered to someone, somewhere. And now Eli mirrored that same instinct, a child already carrying his longing in an object, because presence had failed him. Mark stood still, a sharp ache pressing against his chest. The barrier between father and son wasn't only 2 years of distance. It was the fear of being abandoned that had woven itself into Eli's bones. Each time someone walked away, the boy hugged the backpack tighter, as if to say, "I won't let anyone else disappear." The wind lifted through Eli's hair, tugging at the green-stitched strap. The boy shrank further into himself, clutching the bag against his chest. Mark understood, to reach him, he couldn't simply cross the fence. He had to cross the armor Eli had built from his mother's absence. He didn't rush. The silence wasn't his enemy, it was the only language Eli still trusted. Mark knew his son needed proof that he could endure, that he wouldn't vanish like the smudged promise on that page. In that moment, Mark exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the wooden box, whispering a vow inside himself: he would be presence, not promise. He couldn't rewrite the letter inside the backpack. But he could live out another truth, step by step, until the boy no longer needed to cling to paper to believe he wasn't alone. Evening settled over the town slowly, like an old man folding a blanket with deliberate care. The corner grocery pulled its doors shut, the crooked sign swaying in the wind, its neon bulb dark. Chains rattled against one another with a tired clang, echoing the end of another workday. Across the street, an American flag hung weakly from a porch. Its red had faded to pale pink, its stars nearly swallowed by the cloth. It no longer looked like a symbol, more like a relic kept out of habit than pride. The wind pushed through the roadside trees, filling the air with a restless murmur, as though the houses whispered behind their closed shutters. On the Turner porch, the swing creaked back and forth, repeating its single note, a metronome counting down unseen minutes. Eli sat motionless, the only point of disruption in an otherwise ordinary scene. Mark watched in silence. Everything appeared as he remembered it, and yet nothing was quite the same. There was fragility everywhere, like a thin layer of dust covering the town, left by years of neglect. And in the middle of it, Eli. 6 years old, shoulders bent under the weight of waiting too long, clutching a backpack as if it were life itself. A woman pedaled past on a bicycle, a basket of greens bumping against the handlebars. She nodded briefly toward Mark, her eyes sliding away almost at once. The town was used to soldiers returning. It was used to departures, too. No one asked questions anymore. Who left, who stayed, it was no longer remarkable. Mark swallowed the tightness in his throat. He realized the loneliness here wasn't only his son's. It belonged to the whole place. Everything muted, everything shuddered, with only wind and the porch swing reminding him time was still moving. Against that background, Eli's silence became sharper, like a bold mark drawn across a faded page. He thought of marching through far-off towns overseas, where children sat by roadsides, silent, waiting for someone who would never come back. He remembered their eyes. Now he saw the same look reflected in his boy, in this American town that should have promised safety but instead wore the tired face of a place after war. The last strips of sunlight slid off the rooftops, leaving the dull gray of a fading evening. Eli didn't stir. The swing kept creaking. And Mark knew this moment stood like a crossroads. If he didn't move forward, the waiting would stretch on endlessly. He tightened his grip on the wooden box, inhaled deep, and let the wind rush past his ears, carrying a message he couldn't ignore. It was time to change the rhythm of this silence. A sudden gust swept through, scattering a few loose pages from the sketchpad beside Eli. The paper fluttered with a dry rustle across the porch's stillness. One sheet spiraled down, landing at Mark's worn shoes. He bent to pick it up, hesitant, his breath shallow. The drawing was simple, childlike. Two figures stood close together, one tall, one small, unmistakably father and son. Off to the side, drawn farther away, was the faint outline of a woman, long hair, no face, just a blur of lines fading into white. Mark's chest tightened. He didn't need to ask who it was. Sarah lingered in Eli's memory, but only at a distance, like a shadow standing beyond reach. The space between the figures was the very space inside the boy's heart. Eli didn't move when the paper fell. He kept holding the backpack tight, eyes lowered. Perhaps he had drawn scenes like this many times, then let the wind carry them off as if giving away what he couldn't say aloud. Mark's hand trembled as he held the page. He remembered collecting drawings in war zones, scribbles left by children huddled in shelters. They always showed houses, sons, a father or mother blurred at the edges. And now his own son drew the same way. Another gust shook the corner of the page. Mark realized then, it wasn't only war that left children with half-remembered parents. Even in a quiet American town, absence could wound just as deeply, leaving scars without names. He lifted his eyes toward Eli. The boy sat still, unmoved by the sketch carried away. But Mark knew silence itself spoke loudest. Children didn't always cry or shout. Sometimes they let the wind take their paper. And adults, if they cared enough to notice, would understand. Mark folded the sheet, not into his pocket, not tossed aside, but in his hand, steady. He held it as though it were more than paper, an emblem reminding him that some voids can't be bridged with words, only with presence. On the porch, Eli shifted slightly, as though guarding the remaining sheets from the breeze. He pressed the backpack closer to his chest. His eyes flicked toward his father for just an instant before dropping again. The glance was brief, but enough. The boy still waited, still left space for his mother, for his father, or for whoever might be brave enough to step into that gap. The wind eased. The paper in Mark's hand grew heavier than its weight. He understood, it was no mere child's sketch. It was a map of loneliness. And he would have to learn how to walk into the blank space his son had drawn. Mark drew a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he pulled the small wooden box from his bag. He didn't call out, didn't rush forward. Instead, he placed the box on top of the fence and gave it a gentle push. It dropped with a muted thud, landing just in front of Eli's worn shoes. The boy flinched, head lifting slightly but not looking up. His hands clung to the backpack at first, hesitant. Then, slowly, one hand released its grip, reaching for the box as though approaching something unknown. The lid snapped open. Inside lay a wooden airplane, rough, simple, its wings carved with the shaky letters E.T. Eli Turner. The fading light caught the grooves, highlighting each uneven mark, the kind made by hands more used to rifles than carving knives. Eli said nothing. His wide eyes fixed on the small plane. For a moment, he forgot to clutch the backpack. Both hands closed around the toy, turning it under the dim glow. A thin crack ran along its body, but that flaw made it real, alive with the touch of its maker. On the other side of the fence, Mark's heart hammered. He didn't know if the gift could reach across the silence. He only knew that the plane had kept him alive through nights away, scraped from a piece of scrap wood, carved with his pocket knife, every stroke carrying a desperate hope that his return would not be empty. Eli's finger traced the letters on the wing. He might not fully understand, but something familiar passed through him. His eyes flickered, briefly bright, then quickly lowered again, as though afraid of showing too much. A breeze lifted the little plane from his hands for an instant before it dropped back down. Eli lunged, catching it quickly, pulling it against his chest. The motion stunned Mark. The boy wasn't holding it out of curiosity, he was holding it out of fear of losing it. Just as he clutched his mother's letter, Mark's chest quivered. He realized he had brought home more than wood. He had carried back a part of himself, a witness that Eli had been present in every mile, every night away. And now, by clutching the plane to his chest, Eli had cracked the armor of silence ever so slightly. Mark didn't step closer. He didn't speak. He let the space remain. The box wasn't merely a gift. It was a doorway. And he knew, sometimes the only way to reach a child's heart is to place something fragile in their hands and wait, steady and patient, until they choose to let you in. Eli lifted his head. His brown eyes met Mark's across the short distance between porch and fence. No name was spoken, no explanations given. Just two gazes, one waiting, the other burdened. And then, softly, Eli nodded. The nod trembled like a candle flickering in the wind, fragile enough that Mark feared he'd lose it if he blinked. Yet it carried more weight than any words. It wasn't forgiveness, nor recognition. It was simply a signal, "I see you, Dad." Mark felt the thick wall of 2 years begin to crack, not with sound but with silence. He drew a long breath, his hand tightening around the wooden box, reminding himself that even the smallest shift mattered. The evening wind pressed on, the faded flag stirred once more, the porch swing creaked its same tired rhythm. Everything looked the same. And yet, to Mark, the scene had shifted. In the monotony, the nod stood out like a mark of ink on a blank page, opening a way forward. Eli still clutched the wooden airplane against his chest, his eyes dropping quickly as though he couldn't bear to look again. But Mark knew the downward glance wasn't rejection, it was protection against the swell of feeling. A 6-year-old couldn't articulate it, but the nod was his way of opening the door. Mark held still. He didn't move closer, didn't break the silence. He knew sometimes love wasn't in rushing forward, but in waiting where you were, showing you could hold the space. And in that patience, Mark felt something inside him begin to heal, as if the nod wasn't only for the father, but for the frightened soldier still trembling within. A memory returned, himself as a boy, waiting for a father who never came back. He remembered the ache of a door that never opened, wishing for even the smallest gesture to say he was still seen. Now, his own son had given him that gesture. The sunset thinned, shadows stretching long until they overlapped on the ground. Mark slowly nodded back, almost imperceptible, a reply in kind. No promises, no fanfare. Just a quiet movement that said, "I see you too." In that moment, silence stopped being a barrier. It became their shared language. And Mark understood, from this fragile nod, a beginning had quietly taken root. Mark pushed the gate open. The hinge groaned softly, a small creak that seemed loud in the stillness of the evening. He stepped carefully onto the cold ground, gravel crunching under his boots, each step feeling like another trial he had to pass. The distance now was only a few steps, yet to Mark it stretched longer than any march he had ever endured. He drew a breath, steadied it, feeling his heart press heavy against his ribs. The wooden box stayed in his hand, its rough edge biting faintly into his skin. When he reached the porch, he bent down. His knee struck the hard earth, a sharp pain shooting upward, but he barely noticed. What mattered was that his eyes were level with Eli's now. No longer a father standing over, no longer a boy below. Just two gazes, set on the same plane, meeting in fragile stillness. Eli clutched the wooden plane tightly, his eyes wide, uncertain. The air was so still Mark could hear the dry leaves tapping each other in the yard. He didn't speak. He let his presence fill the space instead, offering steadiness without demand. For an instant, war's shadows flickered, memories of kneeling beside fallen comrades, catching the last breath on their lips. But this moment was not an ending. It was a beginning. He was not a soldier on foreign soil. He was a father, searching for a way back home. A soft breeze shifted Eli's hair across his forehead. The boy leaned slightly, hesitant, as if weighing whether to trust the figure before him. His eyes brightened, then dimmed again, like a small flame flickering against the wind. Mark extended his hand, but stopped halfway, leaving the choice. He didn't want to seize. He wanted Eli to decide. His arm trembled faintly, suspended in the air like a word left unspoken, a silent invitation. Their shadows stretched across the ground, one large, one small. They met in the middle, blending into one, while the two bodies remained apart. Mark realized then, reunions don't always begin with an embrace. Sometimes they begin with the courage to kneel, to place yourself on equal ground. He gave a small nod, eyes steady on his son. In the silence, he told himself, this is no battlefield. This is a porch. And this is where I must stand if I'm to begin again. Eli sprang forward, as if the invisible cord holding him back had snapped all at once. He flung his small arms around his father's neck, his thin frame colliding with Mark's chest, light, yet forceful enough to make him stagger. There were no cheers, no fireworks splitting the sky like in ceremonies for soldiers coming home. Only the sound that mattered, the frantic rhythm of a 6-year-old's heart pounding against Mark's chest. He froze, feeling that quick, uneven beat pressing into the slower, heavier pulse of his own. Two rhythms, mismatched at first, began to fall into step, bridging the space years had carved out. Eli's breath came fast, hot bursts against Mark's collar. It carried both fear and relief, like the gasp after a long unseen run. Mark placed his hand on the boy's back, his broad, calloused palm trembling as it touched the fragile body. In the hush, Eli whispered one word, "Dad." The sound was faint, rasped as though it hadn't been spoken in a long time. Yet to Mark, it thundered louder than any call. A single syllable, enough to erase 2 years, enough to rebuild a bridge thought lost. Mark closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. He didn't try to answer, didn't reach for promises. Words would only weigh on such a fragile thread. He let heartbeat and breath do the speaking, a silent dialogue between father and son. For a flicker, war intruded, memories of carrying comrades, listening as their breaths slipped away. But this time was different. This was living breath, a child's heart hammering with stubborn resilience. And this time, it wasn't parting. It was return. Eli pressed his face into his father's shoulder, the wooden plane wedged between them, its carved letters ET pressing into the fabric of Mark's jacket. Mark knew the mark would linger, a quiet emblem of this day. The sky dimmed, wind whispering through the trees, smoke from a neighbor's chimney drifting across. In such ordinary surroundings, the embrace felt extraordinary. It didn't need witnesses, didn't need a crowd. Just two people, a father, a son, finding each other again through the simplest act of presence. Mark lowered his head, mouthing words he didn't voice, "You're here, and so am I." He couldn't be sure Eli heard. But he knew, through the beat of their hearts, the boy already understood. That night, the little house rested in a pool of yellow light cast by an old ceiling lamp. It wasn't bright, just enough to make a circle of warmth over the scratched wooden table. Eli sat hunched there, a stub of crayon in his hand, worn down from use. On the page, he drew two figures. One tall, one small. The taller held a wooden plane, the smaller reached up, hands touching. Above them, a broad tree stretched its branches wide, sheltering both within its canopy. The lines were clumsy, the colors uneven, but the meaning was clear. Eli was drawing what had just been restored, presence. But in the corner of the page, a patch of white remained. At first, Eli raised a brown crayon and traced a few lines, a woman with long hair. Then he stopped. His hand froze midair, and slowly, he pulled the crayon away. What was left were faint marks, just enough to suggest a shadow, but never a whole figure. Mark stood in the doorway, a few steps back. He said nothing, only watched. From where he stood, he could see his son's hesitation, the quick glance toward the empty space, the way Eli turned away again. He understood that corner belonged to Sarah. The boy had wanted to include her, but no longer had enough faith to finish. The crayon scratched lightly across the paper, filling the sky with uneven blue. Eli worked intently, but his shoulders trembled, carrying a question he couldn't voice. Will she come back? Mark felt the weight of it, but he didn't move to answer. Some questions lived better in silence. Sometimes an empty corner on a page was the only reply. The clock on the wall ticked, the second hand edging forward. In its slow rhythm, Mark thought of his own absences, the empty spaces he had left behind. He had been gone too long, had left his son waiting in silence more than any child should bear. Now Eli wasn't only drawing presence, he was sketching absence too. At last, Eli set the crayon down. He sat still for a moment, then pushed the paper toward the center of the table. His eyes lingered on the blank corner, then shifted to the wooden plane lying beside him. He picked it up, holding it close, as if to remind himself that while the drawing wasn't whole, at least part of it was real. Mark stepped forward, laid a hand gently on his son's back. He didn't try to fill the blank space. He only acknowledged it. Because sometimes, acceptance of silence is the only way to protect the fragile trust that remains. Eli carefully pulled the star-shaped magnet from the corner of the fridge and pressed his drawing against the cold steel. The faint click of the magnet held it in place, simple, almost trivial, yet it meant something. The drawing would not be blown away by wind this time. It had a place, at least within this kitchen. Mark stood behind him in silence. The yellow bulb overhead cast its glow across the page, making the empty corner stand out even more. He didn't ask why Eli left it blank. He didn't try to fill it with words. The emptiness was part of the truth, part of the story they both had to learn to live with. The wall clock ticked on, accenting the stillness of the room. Outside, night wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp grass. To anyone passing by, it would have looked ordinary, nothing remarkable. But to Mark, the scene was immense proof Eli was still trying to piece his world together, through crayons, through silence, even through gaps left uncolored. Eli lingered before the drawing, then turned away, clutching the wooden plane. He said nothing, just settled onto the chair by the window, head resting against his backpack. In that quiet, Mark realized his son didn't need answers right now. What Eli needed was presence, steady, enduring, so that the blank space would not feel like a pit, but like an ordinary part of life's canvas. Mark stepped closer, laying his palm against the fridge door, beside the drawing. His fingers paused at the untouched white corner, and something tight rose in his chest. But instead of sorrow, he felt it as a reminder: some things cannot be replaced, cannot be patched over. They can only be faced, accepted, and carried forward. He stepped back again, his eyes falling on Eli. Eyes half closed, hugging the plane as though holding onto a dream. In the hush, Mark formed a vow, unspoken yet solid: you won't have to wait alone anymore. The drawing remained, the magnet holding fast, the white patch still present. But instead of a fracture, it became a question mark, a quiet question not only for father and son, but for anyone who might pause to look. If one day you see a small signal, eyes waiting, a hand clenched, would you stop, so no one has to wait in silence?